Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with FaithTrust Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for the Meaningful Voices Book Club. We're delighted you're here. We're going to go over a little bit of technical information first, and then I will introduce our presenters. So first of all, you should be able to hear me and see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with your sound, please make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. All audience members are unfortunately muted throughout the presentation, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. You can submit your questions or comments at any time during the presentation, then I will offer them up to the presenters. And if you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, and that will open up the feature options. So we are delighted to be talking about Faithfully Feminist tonight, and we have Dr. Gina Messina-Dysert. She is an American feminist scholar, Catholic theologian, author, and activist. She is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Ursuline College and co-founder of the website feminismandreligion.com. She's authored multiple publications, including Rape, Culture, and Spiritual Violence, and is the co-editor of Faithfully Feminist. She is widely sought after as a speaker and is presented across the U.S. at universities, organizations, conferences, and we have a link to her TED Talk that you can watch, which is great. And then Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is the founder and senior analyst at FaithTrust Institute. She's written extensively on sexual violence and clergy misconduct. Her work is considered foundational in addressing the issues of sexual and domestic violence within both faith communities and secular advocacy organizations. So please send your questions in at any time, and I'm going to hand it over.
Great.
Got it?
Yep. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you very much, Gina, for joining us tonight and for giving us the opportunity to talk about your book, Faithfully Feminist.
Thank you so much to both of you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. And I wanted to start with just a question about how the book came to be. And you will represent your other two colleagues as your editors. But how did you all come up with the idea to do this book, and kind of where did it come from, and what was your goal in doing it?
Sure. Well, as Sarah mentioned in my bio, I co-founded the site feminismandreligion.com, which is this blogging site. We have hundreds of people blogging, blogs going up every day, and we have conversations in those blogs. There's a lot of dialogue that's happening. And one of the conversations that continuously comes up is that people say, well, wait a second, how can you be Catholic and feminist? Or how can you be Jewish and feminist? Or Muslim and feminist? And so on. And, you know, it's the ongoing conversation that people have. You know, feminists feel like, you know, if you're religious, there's no way that you're a true feminist. And, you know, people who are in your religious community think that you are, you know, defying religious rules, right? You know, you're defying God's wishes if you're identifying as a feminist. And so it's, you know, it's kind of like being doubly othered. We talked about it as in the book, being doubly othered. You know, you're othered by the religious community that you belong to, and then you're also othered by the feminist community, which I think is particularly difficult. And so it had been an ongoing conversation, and you know, we ended up speaking with the people at I Speak for Myself, the series. And they loved the idea and wanted it to be, you know, an interfaith book. So we were super excited, and it actually came together very, very quickly. We had a lot of people who wanted to write for it, and a lot of interest. And we were excited to, you know, begin the conversation because, well, I guess not begin, because the conversation is ongoing, but to, you know, put some literature out there to create an opportunity for some voices to speak about how they balance those identities and, you know, why they're both important and the different struggles that we have and how we get through that. So that's really where the idea of the book came from.
Yeah, great, great. Well, let's get into it. So go to our first slide in terms of what we've done is just kind of laid out an outline for discussion tonight for those of you who are joining us. And we want to look first at the kind of common roadblocks for faithful feminists in that we hear throughout the reading in each of the individuals who contribute to the volume. So what we find there are the personal issues, but also the community issues. And some of these, and Gina, please, add to and we'll comment on these as we look at them together.
Right.
But some of the personal faith issues are issues around that are problematic, our toxic theology, God being only represented as male, and for many people, clergy only represented as male, and that feeling of being excluded and silenced within faith communities, but also within the community itself, the way things are organized and the way the community functions, the organizational power issues and people's experience of being excluded from the power structures, being disempowered as women, women's issues and experiences being ignored and dismissed, the gender role expectations being limited, and then the demands placed on women, and the history and institutional responsibility for crimes and particularly issues of violence against women that are part of, unfortunately, all of our faith traditions. So those are some of the things that women talked about consistently through the various individuals. So how do you see those things as the roadblocks that were articulated by our authors here?
Oh, okay, great. I think that this is a really good representation, these lists of the different issues that, feminists who are also religious are dealing with. I mean, certainly we see toxic theology throughout patriarchal religions. And a lot of our authors were discussing this, right, about the different kinds of, or the different pieces of theology that have really impacted them and the way that they understand themselves, and how they have struggled with that within their own lives, within their thoughts about raising their children. And certainly this idea of God being represented as male, right? I often talk about this. I say, it's super embarrassing, but, I thought God was a man until I was in college. And in college was like my first non-Catholic experience. And I remember my professor saying this, this idea of God being referred to male and it being problematic. And I was like, what just happened? Like, what do you mean? I'm so used to saying the Our Father and making the sign of the cross. I was absolutely flabbergasted. And sadly, that's an issue that a lot of men and women and children are dealing with within their faith communities. We're constantly using male language. It's very, very confusing for people. My daughter is 7. And she is so precious and very sassy at the same time, like most 7-year-olds. But she, always talked about God as a woman on her own, which I thought was really sweet because I think she just identified God with herself and her being a female. And then she started Catholic school. And she started saying, no, God is a man. And of course, she's 4. And I'm trying to have these conversations with her, which were probably inappropriate. And she went to school the next day and told her teacher that her mom said that Jesus was a woman, and she didn't quite understand, all of this kind of stuff. And so Sarah's not at Catholic school anymore. That ended up, we had to make some changes, but she still has a lot of questions about that. And I tried to be really open with her in the conversation about, why we use male language, but that we can use female language, and that God is spirit. And I think that most of us encounter those issues. Most of us have a lot of questions about this when we're being raised in the community, and nobody is pointing out that no, God is spirit, but we're just using male language, right? It becomes very confusing. So, in my own personal experience, I've recognized that very, very much. And of course, clergy only being represented as male is highly problematic. I love what Mary Hunt has to say about clergy and this, idea that we need a community that represents the priesthood, right? Not just one person. And I agree with that. But as long as we have clergy, there needs to be women who represent the Spirit of Christ, just as there are men. Now, we do have female rabbis. We certainly do not have female imams. There's issues all around this throughout, these three Abrahamic religions. And, we need to see images of women who are on the altar, or, I'm always talking from a Catholic perspective, so forgive me. But we need to see these kinds of images. It's very, very important. And, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, we have a movement now, the Roman Catholic women priests, who are being ordained kind of in, a movement outside of the church, which is great. But when is the church going to acknowledge that, yes, women can embody the Spirit of Christ, right? When is this going to happen? Particularly in the Catholic Church with Pope Francis in a leadership position, people have been really excited about him and, him being more open to things. But even with Pope Francis, he continues to say, no, women cannot represent the Spirit of Christ. And why is that? And so this is highly problematic. And creates the exclusion, right? Creates the exclusion of women and girls. And it is very, very silencing. And so on a side note, I always say that we need to find creative ways of having voice and having our churches, our mosques, our synagogues hearing us. And we can do that. So go ahead.
Gina, stop for just a minute. Sarah, we're getting a bad connection from you, Gina. Sarah, would it help, do you think, if she went out and came back in?
Well, actually, Marie, you were the one that went in and out. Gina's been on pretty solidly.
Okay, I'm not hearing her solidly at all.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I'm hearing her broken up. So am I the only one hearing that?
Maybe. I'm hearing it okay, but
Okay, if other people are hearing her fine, that's great. That's great.
we'll send a call out to the audience. Give us give us your opinion as to how Gina's sounding, and if she needs to connect. So
Yeah, send us a message if anybody else is having that problem, because it could be my slow connection coming in.
okay, it says Gina sounds clear to me. So I think it's you, Marie.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. I'm the only one that's missing what you're saying, but I'm getting the gist of it.
Okay.
But
I'm sorry.
anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but go ahead.
No, this is great. I'm sorry that it's breaking up a little bit, but
No.
well, in looking for creative ways, I think doing a book like Faithfully Feminist is a great way of getting our voices out there and saying what's important to us. But also, like, I talk about social media and blogging as an important way to create voice, right? Very much women are typically silenced by, the male leadership within religious traditions. And so how do we create the opportunity for voice? And I think that social media, blogging, and these kinds of things have become a great way for people to start sharing voice and getting more involved and calling for change. And Faithfully Feminist was certainly a part of that kind of idea, that we need to have voices heard, to acknowledge these kinds of issues and how they're very destructive, and why it's so very important for feminists remain a part of their religious traditions if it is the right fit for them. And so I often talk about the idea that, you know, with churches saying, you know, you're not really part of our community if you're a feminist, I mean, it's kind of expected, so it doesn't bother me as much. But it bothers me more when I hear it from feminists, right? Because feminists are supposed to be all-inclusive and, you know, honoring each other's commitment to the movement in different ways. And so it's really always very important for me to say that, to me, feminism is about uprooting sexism, but also all oppressions that exist, because you can't uproot one without uprooting all. And that includes, you know, uprooting oppression within religion, right? I mean, you have to, you can't just say, well, it's limited to one place that we're focused on. That doesn't make any sense. And so we definitely are dealing with these patriarchal issues in religion, obviously. So the work there is just as important as it is anywhere else. So we were definitely trying to make these points in this book and saying, like, we want our voices to be heard. This is why feminist work is important within religious communities. And we are not second-class feminists, right? We are not. As a matter of fact, we wrote an op-ed about that called, you know, Religious Women Are Not Second-Class Feminists for the Huffington Post, that I think was really well received, in making the point that honor this work. You know, recognize the work that feminists are doing. And so,
well, but part of the history of that, in terms of relating to secular feminists and the various parts of the women's movement, is dealing with and as I've experienced it and experienced what you've described, is the pain that people have gone through who have left, and with great pain, been driven from their faith communities over the years, and so therefore do not trust that institution at all. And as we've worked with gender-based violence issues, also what advocates have experienced for abused women in dealing with how the faith communities have abused women again, and the struggle of for those women of dealing with their faith communities. And so as we've approached secular feminists been working on gender-based violence, we just assume, in walking into those settings, that there's going to be a lot of baggage there, and that it's legitimate baggage. But it has to be dealt with. It has to be addressed and talked through and acknowledged for what it is. And we have to build bridges of trust, because there's no reason for them to trust any of us who've stayed in those faith communities, because of what they know about how things go down in faith communities. They've been there, they've seen it, and they've seen the damage it's done to particularly victims of violence. So I think it's also important for us as feminists of faith to recognize that. And it's partly our job in building that bridge to certainly acknowledge and begin there with folks, as well as then expecting, you know, some respect for the fact that we're still there trying to do the work within that patriarchal setting. So it's a two-way thing.
No, I absolutely agree with you. Specifically when we're talking about sexual violence and domestic violence, I certainly recognize how damaging the church can be, or any patriarchal religion can be, right? And it makes sense that women who have experienced those types of violence have chosen to leave the faith community. Excuse me. And I think that we each have to make choices that are right for us, and what works for us, right? for me, and this, and this is a little off path, but um, how do you maintain your faith within your tradition when you're dealing with so many things? Ivani Gabara, if you're familiar with Ivani Gabara, I had seen her speak a few years ago, and she's a Catholic nun who lives in Brazil and has been re-educated by the Catholic Church because they were not happy with the work that she was doing. And I asked her, how do you stay in the church? And I was expecting something very different than what she said. But she said with one foot in and one foot out, which I thought was really fascinating. And for her, staying in the church was about being able to work with the people that she really cared about in her community, right? And I often think that each of us maintains our faith in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean going to Mass every Sunday. It doesn't mean, participating in particular rituals that we're uncomfortable with. For me, it's all about social justice. I feel like as long as I am focused on those ideas of social justice, that I'm very tied to the mission of the Catholic Church that leaves out all of those kinds of things that are so troubling. And when talking to women who are dealing with sexual and domestic violence, I think it is so critical to acknowledge the ways that religion has been very, very damaging, the way that it is a second victimization, right? And that we need to address that. And that is an ongoing conversation that needs to be had. As a matter of fact, Stephanie Arel, which, I'll send some information about her work. She's actually very, very focused on this, looking at trauma, around sexual violence, domestic violence, and other forms of gender-based violence, and how that is amplified by patriarchal religion. So we have to continue that conversation. And I think, me maintaining a Catholic identity does not mean that I would agree in any way with those issues. And matter of fact, that's part of the mission, is to interrupt those.
Sure. But I was interested as I read through the book in terms of, as I was kind of looking for as women talked about their struggles, I was looking for which ones of them were struggling around their victimization issues, who explicitly talked about it. And on page 159, let me see who this was. Marcia.
Marcia.
Yeah.
Marcia Mount-Shoup. Yes.
Yeah, so she talks about being a survivor of sexual violence is a tipping point for both my staying and my straining to stay. So that for her, it was a both and in terms of pushing her to beyond staying, but also keeping her there in terms of, I'm assuming, what she was getting from her community in that particular moment of crisis that she was dealing with. But then she goes on to critique the church. Many of the church's habits, patterns, and practices are the opposite of what survivors like me need. The easiest part of staying is that I believe the church has the capacity to be a healing space. So, her commitment to the potential for her faith community to be that place that can support survivors, which I certainly believe in, but I also rarely see. And so her struggle at that point in her life was pretty stark in terms of going through that experience and her expectations of her faith community. I was also struck by one of the rabbis, Rabbi Rutenberg, on page 145. and she begins by talking about in her studies confronting the text in the Talmud about rape in Jewish teaching, and the particular way in which the Talmud was discussing had a woman been raped as a part of discussing her whether or not she was suitable for marriage and so forth, whether or not she was a virgin and all this, and her realizing that that was going to be a part of her rabbinic responsibilities was dealing with these kinds of texts and trying to, come to terms with them and sort through them and then figure out how to teach them and how to draw out what was really important about the text and let go of the rest of it. So for her, that was the point of encountering her struggle with her faith tradition. Is, do I want to do this? Is this, what am I going to do? How do I do this as a feminist? This is ridiculous to have to do this, but it's my faith, and I value the text, and that's an important part of who I am and and what it means to be in leadership as a rabbi. So throughout this, there were people both talking about their personal experience and then also talking about the teachings of their tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested in how both presented significant challenges that people work through in terms of their decisions to stay.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a number of things to address here. First of all, when we're talking about religious texts, we have to ask the question of who wrote those texts, right? I mean, they're all written by men from male perspectives. They don't consider women's perspectives at all. The women's voice is largely lost. And looking at any of these texts, the rape of Gina in the book of Genesis, I've seen it analyzed as the rape of Shechem, where they don't even talk about Dina, right? And isn't this kind of obvious what the issue is when we have primarily white men who are analyzing texts and doing the interpretations and who have written these texts, that of course women voices are lost. And so how do we go back and read from the woman's perspective, from the victim's perspective? How do we change the way we're looking at the text? And I think that that's where we need to start. We need to acknowledge who has written it and why these experiences are not acknowledged and are missing. And we need to change the way we're reading the text and look for the voice of that person. One of the texts that I find most damaging in the Bible is in the book of Samuel and relates to King David's 10 concubines who are taken upon the roof and are raped by his son in the sight of all Israel to see. And I remember talking with one of my male professors, and he said to me, well, this is a political coup, it's not rape. And I said, well, what if you asked any of those women? I bet that they would have a very different opinion. And he just did not get that at all. And I'm like, where are their voices? Why can't we acknowledge their experience rather than saying, well, no, this is what it's really about. And I know this because I'm this great biblical scholar, right? So I think that that's really critical, is that we have to acknowledge that. And always going back to the faith tradition itself. Like, what is the foundation of the faith tradition, and what are man-made rules, man-made laws, right, and man-made interpretations, male interpretations. And when I talk about, Catholicism or Christianity, I talk about, the teachings of Jesus, which to me are based on love, inclusion, liberation, and social justice. So if we're talking about those elements, they certainly don't fit with the ideas of, oppressing rape victims and domestic violence victims and saying, you need to stay in an abusive home. That does not make any sense, right? This is a very, very limited viewpoint of, an institution built on patriarchy. And so those are critical conversations to continue. You know, and when we're thinking about what I think Ivana Gabara said, one foot in and one foot out, I thought a lot about that when reading Marcia Mount Shoup's essay on where she was with her church. You know, finding part of it so problematic and feeling very ambivalent, or, you know, sitting in the pew and just being angry, and then at the same time needing that community for her healing. And it's a struggle. It's a major, major struggle. So yeah, I think these are critical conversations, and I really appreciate what a lot of our authors did within this text in addressing those and thinking about how do I stay within an institution that can be so highly problematic.
One of the things I noticed or I thought I noticed, I'm interested in your perspective on, because you were obviously more involved with the authors here, but I had a sense in the folks who were converts to whichever faith tradition they had chosen to participate in, that they were a little less ambivalent. And I was wondering if that's because they were converts and they had, on some level, had come to terms with whatever the tradition was before they made their decision to step into it, or perhaps they weren't as they didn't see as much of it yet as they might 10 years from now, living into it, or I don't know. Did you have any sense of that, or was it just my sense of it?
No, that's a really, really interesting question. And I think specifically of Elizabeth Meacham, who converted to Judaism, and she refers to herself as a Buju, and likes to really bring together Buddhism and Judaism in her beliefs, and, you know, entered Judaism very much as a feminist, and I think had made peace with certain things, and you know, chose to focus on her own interpretations in the way that she was going to engage with that community. And I think that is a big difference. Like when you're converting to a tradition as a feminist, then you're already very aware of a lot of the issues, right? And you're processing those and making your own decisions. And so I think that it makes sense that those women are a little bit less ambivalent and are participating in these traditions in a little bit of a different way than those who, you know, were born into those traditions.
Right.
So yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious about, and it would be interesting to talk with them, you know, 10, 20 years into their experience to kind of see how that reads for them then, you know, or how it's changed for them. But in any case, it seemed to me that the common thread there was also for those of us who did grow up in the tradition we're still in.
Yes.
And have chosen to stay, and then came to feminism at some point as young adults. In that it's really about the paradox. It's kind of living the paradox of, you know, knowing what we know, and still choosing to live within it. There was one quote. See if I can find it quickly here. Catherine House said, she's quoting, I guess, Natalie Watson, whom I don't know, but she says, often about learning to live with ambivalence to somehow make sense of the reality of oppression and empowerment, of liberation and suffering, of silence and powerful speech at the same time. So it's that both and, but living with that and not for that not being enough of a contradiction to have to say, I can't live with the contradiction any longer.
Right.
That somehow we've learned to either tolerate the contradiction or find some peace within that paradox or some energy within that paradox that means that we choose to stay within it.
Right.
And I heard that consistently.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, as I said, I think it goes back to identifying what the foundational roots of the tradition are versus what, again, the patriarchal, aspects that have developed over time, and being able to separate that and say, this is really what I'm going to focus on and what I'm going to believe in. And, some people say that's being, a cafeteria Catholic in my case. But I always like to quote Rosemary Redford Ruther, who says, if you go into the cafeteria, you can pick up the fruit or the chocolate cake, and progressives pick up the fruit. Right? Yeah, I love that she says that. But because, if you look at a lot of conservative Catholics who believe in the death penalty or believe in war and these kinds of things, to her, that's the chocolate cake. And I would absolutely agree with that. So, when you're dealing with that paradox, it's like, what am I going to focus on here? And I think for a lot of feminists who are born into their traditions, it's, this is a crisis of identity. It's a cultural issue. Being Jewish is very cultural. Being Catholic is very cultural. Being Muslim is very cultural. So there's two pieces of it as well. Not only your faith, but also your cultural identity, and how those things are tied together. And so there's a lot happening that a person has to deal with in thinking about how I'm going to maintain my own identity and understand who I am and how I fit within my family, within my community, within my religious tradition, and so on. And so we do struggle with that, and like you said, look for ways to exist. And, for the women who choose to stay, I really believe it's because there's a number of things going on there, but again, because they recognize what the roots of their tradition are.
And I think the particularities of that for all of us, in terms of whatever our social locations are, whether as women of color, and our particular faith tradition, all the cultural nuances are major issues. But let's look for a minute at some of the things about community that the women have talked about in the book. In the hard moments, and using the words of Mormon feminist Joanna Brooks, I pray, God, make me brave enough to love my people. How wonderful it is to have people to love. This is from Caroline Klein.
Yes. I want to say that Caroline's essay, I think, is just one of my favorites in this collection. I think it's so well written and well said. And, for Caroline being in the Mormon faith, this is a very, very conservative tradition. And she's constantly, talking about women's agency, and honoring where they are in their faith, and honoring the fact that these women have agency. I hope you can't hear that. Could you hear that? My phone was ringing. Sorry. My ringer's off, but it rings on my computer. I don't know how to shut that off. And how she wants to, honor, honor where people are coming from, and the fact that these people show her so much love, and how lucky she is to be in a community like that, regardless of the struggles that she has. And it's really, I am always in awe of Caroline and her work, and the things that she's doing. So, sorry.
Yeah. And then Amy Levine, feminism is the faith that inspires and strengthens me to act, and Judaism is the religion that gives me the language, community, and home to do it. I found that a really interesting expression of the way her feminism and Judaism come together. Um, and to say that feminism is the faith and Judaism is the religion, which
Yeah. I love it. It's really, really beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Hannah Heinzeker, is
Yes.
that right? Heinzeker?
Yeah.
Why don't you read that one?
Sure. It says, truthfully, although it can be dangerous to simply equate religion with any one culture, my Mennonite faith is more than simply that. It's my way of life. It's what I know. It's the food and the songs and the people and the church rhythm that I'm used to. And these memories hold powerful sway. And it's still a source of support and stability in my life. I love all of these quotes. I love all of them, and I think they're so beautiful. And I think so many of us, who maintain a feminist and faith identity, can really understand what these women are saying, in how they participate in their faith communities, how it brings them comfort, and at the same time, their feminism is critical, to them participating in their faith, right? Understanding the necessity of, activism, and how that really does come together and intertwine with, these messages of social justice, and liberation that we see throughout our religious traditions. So I, for one, read these, and it almost brings me to tears, because I feel like I so understand this. I grew up in a very conservative Catholic church, and it's still super conservative. The priest that was there when I was 5 is still there. He does not speak to me because he knows I identify as a feminist, and he fears me a bit. I sometimes want to touch him to see if he thinks he's going to set on fire. I want to show him it's not going to happen.
Right.
But I still go there. I still go there, and it brings me a lot of comfort to go there, even though the things they are saying make me crazy. There's something about being in that pew and listening to music and being part of that ritual that is home for me. And so, I hear these women's stories, and I find meaning, and I find my own experience in that. And that's another thing that I think is so critical about doing work like this, is that, we need to hear each other's stories, because this is where you know, we find our own voices.
But also reminds us what a high price is at stake for people, and when it's women struggling around their feminism and their faith. But then if you add on top of that issues of sexuality, so for lesbian women or trans women, and the church's rejection, the churches that still reject people, the tragedy and the pain that causes, because of these very things, and how important these very things are to so many people, to basically be driven away from this important community in people's lives, and just simply not being able to stay
Right.
because of those parts of our lives. It just it's it just expands the
It is. It's absolutely devastating and completely unacceptable.
yeah.
And I was recently at a conference for JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and we were on a panel with Jerusha Lamptey, who is just a brilliant Mormon feminist theologian at Union Theological Seminary. And she said, I need to say that if God wants me to discriminate against, any person for any reason, that's not a God I want to worship. And I really appreciated her saying that, and I think that's such a critical point. If we think about, the God of our faith, if this is a God that is telling us to treat others poorly or to participate in oppression, is this really the religion that we want to participate in, or is this really the God that we want to honor or follow? And I think that's something that we need to think about very critically. Because again, if we go back to those roots, inclusion,
fundamentals,
equity, right? That is not what our tradition is calling us to do. And I'm really grateful for the various communities that are, focused on embracing every person and honoring love as love. And those are communities I like to participate in as well, right? But as you say, it's really damaging not being able to go back to those places. That even though, they're problematic, they bring some sort of comfort because of.
Yeah, and even though it's a contradiction on some level. But it also, the segue there I want to go to in terms of some of the writing that you bring us in this book, the number of Muslim authors that you have where the women talk about from the very beginning that there is no contradiction for them. And I thought that was really fascinating, and I was intrigued and by the communities they must be in, where they are getting an interpretation and teaching early on of what Islam really means, which is the religion of peace, and inherent in Islam is the equality of men and women, and the teaching of nonviolence and so forth. But just the tone of their pieces were so different, because they were sort of like, well, what's the problem? that I grew up Muslim and feminist, and how can you be a Muslim and not be a feminist, and why are people struggling with this? And it was sort of refreshing, like, oh yeah, that's and not all the Muslim women had that experience in the book, but the ones that did, and I think it's always been fascinating to me when I've been in conversations with Muslim colleagues about that frankly, unlike our tradition as Christians, we've got a history of teaching, and it's not to say there aren't patriarchal issues within Islam, and certainly a lot of cultural baggage that's been a part of it. But in our Christianity, the baggage is huge. The patriarchal baggage is huge. But way back in the basic teaching, which is where you're talking about, which is why I think most of us kind of hang on to it. What Jesus was talking about is the fundamentals, but there's so much baggage in between that most of us have been taught. That's where we end up struggling with the patriarchy of our tradition, and then having to come to terms with that. But it was kind of delightful to hear those young women talk about, it's not an issue. I'm a Muslim feminist, and that's who I've always been, and that's who you are if you're a Muslim. It's like, right on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say that I think the work of women like Amina Wadud, have made such an incredible impact within the Islamic tradition. And I'm so disappointed that Jennifer Zubair couldn't be here, because again, her chapter is so incredible, and one that I like to go back to often. And Amina Wadud was really, really critical for her in coming to understand her own, feminist identity, and her Muslim identity. But I think, you know, Islam, the tradition itself and what people really focus on is so different. You know, like you said, the baggage that we hold on to in Christianity. And it is refreshing. It is very, very refreshing. And I know Jennifer has a lot of thoughts on that in the way that women, you know, exist within their tradition. And so does Maria Ibrahimji, who is the series editor of the book, and just absolutely brilliant and has so much to say about this. And I think there's a lot to learn for the rest of us from these women.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's look at these the challenge. What our writers have been saying about the challenges of text and interpretation, because these are some of the things that you know, we've been raising here. But Diana Kelly Said says, there are parts of the Quran interpreted in ways that alienate me as a woman and as a member of humanity, and I'd stifle a scream when I heard men and women bow to these interpretations. What bothered me about the assumptions some Muslims made about women in Islam were not only structural issues like access to educational and economic resources, but also certain interpretations that denied women ownership of our faith experience. So there she's talking about, you know, the baggage, the pieces that have come to be put into the teachings that have basically been patriarchal in nature. It's what I've come to call across our traditions over the years. It's religion in service to patriarchy. So it's really about patriarchy, but the religion serves the needs of patriarchy.
Right.
In terms of you know, what's the point? So it's not about the original teaching of the religion, you know, really informing social structures, how they should be, but it's a social structure that has its own function and its own, you know, point to do whatever it's doing, and then it draws on religion to serve it instead of, you know, something else. And that's what I always think of when I read a reference like that. So then Amanda, is it Qureshi? Do you know this one?
Yes.
You want to read that one?
Yes, absolutely. She says, I've been asked before why I stay in a religion that consistently relegates me to a second-class status. And my answer is simple. I shouldn't have to give up God and my faith community just because religious scholars have failed to recognize my innate worth in their interpretation of Islam. Does that make me stubborn, a troublemaker? So be it. I'm in good company. I love it. I absolutely love it. You know, one of the things in specifically about Islam that I think is so important to mention here is society's interpretation of Islam at this moment, and the political nature that it brings. And in fact, we noticed that there were some op-eds written about this book that were put out, you know, in different publications like the Washington Post and, you know, Huffington Post and whatever. And these pieces would be very generous to the Christian and Muslim, or I'm sorry, the Christian and Jewish pieces. But then when they would talk about a Muslim piece, it was very interesting the way that they portrayed it, rather than honoring the agency of the person. It was kind of like, look at this horrible situation, right? And we actually had to confront some of the journalists that had written these pieces to say, this is your own bias coming out, and this is the problem that we have within society. Yes, absolutely. It was so unbelievable. And we were like, this is what we see every day in society, that people have these preconceived notions about the tradition of Islam. And even within these reviews, that there was so much to pull from this book, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they would focus on these very, very negative aspects of Islam. And so we did confront those head on in hoping that some people would retract or change. And some people did adjust their pieces and some did not. But um, you know, in listening to what like Amanda has to say here, and you know, about this idea that she's a troublemaker or that she's stubborn, and that she's judged for being this, you know, this second-class status. I don't think she's only talking about her faith. I think she's also talking about the greater community judging her for maintaining, you know, a Muslim feminist identity.
And I would assume, particularly in the U.S. and Western Europe, it's even harder for Muslim feminists to be critical within the tradition. I mean, it's the same old story about, you know, talking about your own community critically, because if you're a marginal community, because then you're feeding the prejudice of the dominant community. And so that it's always that, you know, do I raise issues that I need to raise within my own community at the risk of it being misused by the dominant community to perpetuate oppression and blah blah blah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
particularly at this point in time. Yeah. So back to Rabbi Rutenberg, the misogyny in Judaism's ancient texts is so pervasive that it's almost become, in a lot of ways, just absolutely normalized. Once you lose beginner's mind, it's almost hard to see, almost. So I think she's saying there that, again, it is just there. It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, it
And
is very normalized in our society. It's
yeah.
very normalized. I mean, just, you know, when going back to talking about sexual and domestic violence, and the treatment of women in society, you know, issues around sexuality, they are embedded in these texts, and people have, you know, grabbed onto them, and they are very pervasive in, you know, our social structures and within our politics. You know, I often talk about, you know, our political systems and the way that we treat women's issues, and we are approaching those from a very, very patriarchal understanding of religious texts. So much for separation of, you know, religion and state, right? But it's highly problematic, and it is so pervasive, as she says. How do we interrupt that? How do we interrupt that? It's such an important question.
And, you know, scholarship is a huge part of that, on the one hand, in terms of the academy's role, but also the role of faith leaders in the community on the ground, and what they're teaching and preaching is the other part of that. And so the two, I think, are critical in terms of social change. And you know, the academy's got to do the work of, you know, changing what's taught at that level, and then, you know, those of us who are out here in the trenches have got to take what we learn in the academy and learn from academics and transfer that in ways that the folks in the pews can understand and appreciate the difference, so that you begin to really change what's normal and what's accepted. And that's, you know, I mean, we've certainly seen that over the time that we've been doing this at FaithTrust. That is a long term project. That's not something, I mean, that's a generational, I mean, literally over generations that's going to change. It is changing, but it's not a one generation, you know, activity.
Right. It's going to take a lot of time. And I think one of the, you know, problems that we have is that it's easy to look at these texts and to pull out the problems, but how do we then reinterpret in a way that is non-sexist, right? How do we liberate these texts from a feminist perspective, rather than just talking about what's wrong with them? I think that's another piece that's often missing when we talk about these things.
Or just ignore them, and
right.
Yeah, which we really can't do that either. So, okay, one more from Rabbi Rittenberg. In order to make change, we have to know our stuff, which means we have to engage with the more troubling of our sacred texts. But when we do so with the intention of enabling people of all genders to connect with God through our tradition, I believe we sanctify the holy name. And I appreciate, I really liked her article. I have to say it was one of my favorites in terms of kind of the depth of her understanding of her role of struggling with the sacred text, and what it meant for her choosing to stay there and do that. I found it particularly encouraging the way that she talked about that. So.
Danya does such amazing work, and she has a great talk that she did that's kind of like a TEDx talk, but it's I believe it's a specific Jewish forum, but is styled very, very similarly. And I am always, so enthralled with her work and what she has to say. And so, if I can find that link, I'd love to send it to you, and if you want to share it with people, because she gives an excellent talk, on this. So that'd be great.
Yeah, no, that'd be super. We can certainly add that to the website as a bonus for folks who are listening in tonight.
Great.
Okay, so Sarah, do we have anything else there that we particularly were looking at?
Well, the last piece was the generational differences.
So this is another thing that I was thinking about as I read, and wanted to get your take on, Gina. My sense was that most of your authors are young women, your age, about I don't know, 30s and 40s.
30s and 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Okay.
And we really wanted to focus on the age group because we also wanted to make the point that there is this younger generation that is continuing the work, right? So we really wanted to focus on that.
Right, which I thought was great. But here's something else that Rabbi Rittenberg had to say that I thought was interesting. Part of how I stay in this tradition is that I'm the very lucky beneficiary of the exhausting, tireless work of Jewish feminists who came before me. The ones who fought innumerable battles, faced the ire of the male Jewish establishment, suffered all manner of indignities, and blazed all manner of trails in order to change Jewish culture. I can stay in my tradition in large part because other women already did the work to make Judaism a much safer street to walk down at night. So what's your sense of that as you interacted with your peers around this?
Yes, well, what she has to say here, I think, we all understand. There are women who have done the work before us, right? Who have paved the way so that we can kind of continue on and continue moving forward to working for this change, and we need to honor that. I am so grateful to the women who I've worked with, who have mentored me, and for all of that they've done for not only our individual traditions, but for feminism as a whole. It really needs to be honored. And because of their work, it's made it easier for us to speak up in this generation, right? It's the struggle is not as difficult as it was for those founding mothers. And so yeah, I think that that's so, so important. And I really love what, she has to say about this here. We think about, the different battles that these women have fought. Rosemary Redford Ruther was my dissertation advisor and my mentor. And I always say, God, and there are a few people that I love, like I love Rosemary. And her work is just so, so fabulous. And, it's also very clear some of the things that she's dealt with because of her identity as a Catholic feminist and, limitations in job offers and, invitations that have been refused and those kinds of things. But she's maintained that and not backed down. And she's taught a lot of us to be courageous, right? To be brave and to keep moving forward. Because even though there are so many who, don't agree with our work or want to battle it, it doesn't change the fact that our work is important, that we need to stand up for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of what pleases me in a volume like this is also seeing that, how many of you there are, but also how many of you there are that don't take much for granted. Because it's one of the things that worries me about some young women who I think we're at a political period at this point where a lot of folks are learning not to take anything for granted, but I think it's always a temptation, I think, to take for granted. Well, that was taken care of in the 60s or the 70s, or we've already dealt with that, or those laws already passed, or that was already won, or whatever. It's like no.
Yes.
I mean, we made a lot of progress, but none of it can be taken for granted because it can go away tomorrow.
Well, and we're seeing that right now, right? And we're seeing that right now.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I hear this all the time, this idea that women have made it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, we have so much to talk about,
Right. And I didn't hear that in anybody here. But still, an awareness and appreciation of, there's been progress, certainly, thanks be to God. But clearly the work is to be done, and you pick up right where you are, and you just keep moving. So I appreciated her expression of that very much. And then finally, Kate McElwee, her comment here, so I want to leave this one for you.
Sure. During a feminist theology seminar, Mary Hunt came to visit, and I asked her that token nagging question, why do you stay? Her response has guided my own Catholic path ever since. We have a responsibility to speak this language. This is what a Catholic looks like. We have a responsibility to speak in the name of Catholicism as women and as feminists. We cannot be spoken for by the patriarchy. I love that. I absolutely love that. And I of course, am, such a fan of Mary Hunt and absolutely adore her. I'm so grateful for her work. And I love everything that she has to say. And it's important for us to hear. It's important for us to hear and to think about how we need to continue to move forward. And just what you were saying, Marie, and building on what you said and what Mary Hunt here said, is that, I think that so often we get bogged down and we feel like, why am I bothering? This isn't going to change. Like, am I wasting my breath? Am I wasting my energy? And I always like to go back to Sharon Welch. She wrote the book, A Feminist Ethic of Risk, and this idea that we need to have this mature attitude to recognize, as you said, we have a lot, this is going to take a lot of generations ahead of us, to change. but our work is necessary today so that if that change can happen 5 generations down the road or whatever it may be, right? Thinking about the work that we have built on, when we talk about your work, Marie, or the work of Mary Hunter, or Rosemary Edward Ruther, or Amina Wadud, Dolores Williams, when I think about those women, but then I'm even thinking about generations way before that, thinking about the women who fought for the right to vote, women's suffrage, and, thinking about goddess communities, and, the work that Carol Christ is doing, and thinking about where we are today and the generations that have passed, and we would not be where we were at without the work of those women. So I think we all need to remember that is when it becomes exhausting and we become super frustrated and, you want to just tear your hair out, which I think we all feel that way sometimes. We need to remember that, no, it's critical, and our work is going to change lives of, women, men, and children in the future. And so we need to honor that, be mature about our work, right? Yeah.
Yes. And at those points, in terms of Mary's point, where you just want to crawl in a hole and say, I'm done. I can't do this. That's when you stand up and say, no, this is what a Catholic looks like, or whoever we are. It's owning that they can't take this from me.
Yes.
That, and I think that for a lot of us, that's the bottom line about staying, as it were. It's no, they can't throw me out. I mean, they can try, but because this really is who I am. This is my heritage. This is where I've come from. And I'm here because I am faithful to my ancestors' teaching and what they brought me up in this and so forth. And they can't, take it from me. So this is who I am. They have to deal with it.
Right.
And so they need to get over it. I don't need to get over it. They need to get over it.
Get over it, right? I love that. And I think that's what Amanda Kurishi was also saying, right? Like,
yeah.
You're not taking my God away from me.
Right.
Who are you, right?
Right.
You're going to say this. No way.
Right.
I love that.
No. So anyway, but I think that's what then that's where we're then grounded to keep going and also to know who our people are. So that's how, that's those associations and communities that you were talking about earlier, that that's how who's going to be there for you, and that's who you march with, and all of that, so that you're able to keep going and keep doing the work. So that's what I got from reading this, and really appreciate that opportunity to do so and to share the conversation with you about the book and the people involved. I wish I could meet them all, but I feel like I've met them a little bit in their writings. And so as you talk with them, please thank them for all of us and for the opportunity to have the conversation. And any last thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, again, let me say thank you so much for having me and for reading the book and, for being part of the dialogue. I'm really, really grateful. And this has just been a wonderful experience. And, my hope is that the book continues to draw people into the conversation, and that we continue to have conversations and move forward with that. And so, I hope that if you read your book and you want to pass the copy on, pass it on, and, encourage it. And also, I always like to tell people, feminismreligion.com, it's this blogging project. We love it. We think it's important. And if you want to join our conversation there, we'd love to have you. submit a piece, to be on the blog, participate in the dialogue on the different articles that are posted. We have a lot of interesting conversations. And something that started out as a very small project with 4 women, myself and 3 other women, has grown, and we have readers in 181 countries now.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, it's just shocking. But it shows that this is an issue that people really care about and that we need to continue talking about. So I hope that, you'll join the conversation and,
So
yeah.
would you like to have my blog on your blog?
Yes, would love that.
So great. Sarah, are you listening? Sarah.
I'm listening, Marie.
Okay.
I hear.
Sarah will be in touch.
Excellent. That is excellent. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
That's
excellent.
great. Well, and Sarah, tell us what you have here in the additional resources.
So these are available. These are links on our website on the Feminist, Faithfully Feminist book page. But so there's the article that Gina was talking about, Don't Treat Religious Women Like Second-Class Feminists. There's a link to Gina's TED Talk, and then there's Water and Jofa and just other resources for women in religion. So, and if you have anything you'd like to add to that, please let me know, because this is me just pulling things together.
Oh, great, great. Yes, yes. Excellent. I may have some additional links that I'll send your way. And
that would be great.
One last thing, if I can. I just want to say that I hope that every person, who is here in this conversation, and every person in general recognizes the power of our voices, and to use your voice, to speak out, and find creative ways to do it, find safe ways to do it, and know that your voice has the ability to make a big difference, right? So, again, join the conversation and don't allow yourself to be silenced, I guess is what I want to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right on. Okay, Sarah, anything else tonight?
Just to let everyone know, our next book is going to be Women, Ritual, and Power by Elizabeth Ursick, and we don't yet have a date, but Elizabeth will be joining us, so that should be a great conversation about women's representation in worship. So thank you so much for being here, Gina. This was just delightful. And this is it, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night, and we'll see you at the next time.
Excellent.
Thanks very much. Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.